The manila folder on the Pentagon conference table bore the distinctive red top secret stamp across its cover. Below it, in precise military stencil, were the words, Naval Base Jefferson Bay, Operation Internal Shield. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the faces of the four-star admirals and intelligence chiefs who sat in rigid attention as Admiral James Harrison, a weathered 62-year-old with silver hair, and the unmistakable bearing of a former Navy SEAL stood at the head of the table. Harrison's calloused index finger jabbed at the glossy surveillance photos spread before him. The images showed the USS Michael Murphy and our Lee Burke-class destroyer, its bow angled dangerously toward the concrete pier as tugs scrambled to prevent a collision. The date stamp showed this near catastrophe had occurred just 3 weeks ago. Ladies and gentlemen, Harrison's voice carried the gravitas of a man who had commanded respect across 4 decades of service. What you're looking at isn't just an isolated incident. It's the culmination of a systemic failure at Jefferson Bay, our premier West Coast naval installation. He clicked a remote, and the large screen behind him flickered to life with a series of damning statistics. Equipment failure rates up 42%. Supply discrepancies exceeding 4.5 million. Personnel complaints increased threefold. Operational readiness down to concerning levels. At the far end of this table sat Admiral Morgan Hayes. At 28, she was the youngest admiral in Navy history, her meteoric rise through the ranks fueled by a combination of tactical brilliance and unflinching resolve. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform impeccable. Unlike the other officers who shifted uncomfortably as the presentation continued, Hayes remained perfectly still, her eyes cataloging every detail. The Pentagon has tried conventional approaches, Harrison continued, his voice dropping an octave. Inspections, audits, personnel changes, nothing has worked. Whatever's happening at Jefferson Bay runs deeper than standard oversight can detect. He paused, fixing his gaze directly on Hayes. That's why Admiral Hayes has been selected to assume command of the base effective next week. A silver-haired vice admiral from Naval Intelligence raised a skeptical eyebrow. With all due respect to Admiral Hayes's record, isn't she rather? He hesitated, searching for a diplomatic term, junior for such a problematic assignment. Hayes didn't flinch at the implied criticism. She'd heard variations of it throughout her career. Too young, too female, too everything except what the old guard expected. Harrison's weathered face cracked into a tight smile. Junior, perhaps. Conventional, definitely not. And that's precisely what Jefferson Bay needs right now. He nodded toward Hayes. Admiral, would you explain your proposed approach? Morgan stood, her posture military perfect. Thank you, Admiral Harrison. Her voice was clear and authoritative, without the need to raise its volume. Gentlemen, the traditional command transition process gives bases weeks to prepare, essentially allowing them to hide their true operational conditions. I propose something different. She walked to the screen, bringing up schematics of the sprawling California naval base. I will arrive at Jefferson Bay 5 days before my official introduction under the guise of a lieutenant recently transferred from Norfolk. This will allow me to observe actual operations, identify key personnel issues, and pinpoint systemic failures without the filter of ceremonial presentations. The conference room erupted with objections. Completely unorthodox, security risks, chain of command violations. Harrison silenced the room with a raised hand. The Secretary of the Navy has already approved this operation. This isn't a committee decision. When quiet returned, Hayes continued. During my 5 days undercover, I'll establish the true operational baseline of Jefferson Bay. Only then can we implement effective remedial measures. Her eyes scanned the room, meeting each skeptical gaze. Gentlemen, we can continue with traditional approaches and watch this critical installation deteriorate further, or we can try something unprecedented. After the meeting adjourned, Harrison remained behind with Hayes. The conference room, now empty except for the two of them, seemed cavernous. Through the reinforced windows, the Potomac River gleamed in the afternoon sun, Pentagon police conducting their regular patrols along its banks. They're not convinced, Morgan said, gathering her notes. Harrison leaned against the table, his weathered face thoughtful. They don't need to be. You convince the secretary, and that's what matters. He paused, his expression softening slightly. Your father would have approved of this approach, you know. Morgan's hands stilled momentarily at the mention of her father, the late Admiral William Hayes. His portrait hung in the Naval Academy's Hall of Honor, his career a testament to innovation and unwavering integrity. He always did favor the unexpected tactical advantage. Harrison nodded, memories of past operations flickering behind his eyes. East Berlin, 1987. The Stasi had compromised our usual intelligence channels. Your father and I conducted a similar operation, entering as low-level diplomatic staff to assess the situation without alerting Soviet counterintelligence. He reached into his briefcase and retrieved an aged leather notebook, its corners worn smooth from decades of handling. Take this. It contains the observation techniques we developed during Cold War operations. How to watch without being noticed. How to catalog vulnerabilities without taking notes. How to identify the weak links in command structures. Morgan accepted the notebook, feeling the weight of its history. You never told me you worked with my father in Berlin. Harrison's eyes crinkled at the corners. Some operational details remain classified even after all these years. He stood straighter, his tone shifting from mentor to superior officer. 5 days, Admiral. Observe, document, and prepare. On the 6th day, we implement the most comprehensive command restructuring the modern Navy has ever seen. Dawn broke over San Diego with military precision as Morgan Hayes stepped from the commercial flight that had carried her from Washington. She wore civilian clothes, jeans, a simple navy sweater, and comfortable boots with her hair loose around her shoulders. The only hint of her military bearing was her perfect posture and the alert assessment in her eyes as she surveyed the terminal. A young petty officer held a sign reading Lieutenant Hayes. Morgan approached him with the slightly uncertain air of a junior officer at a new posting. Lieutenant Morgan Hayes, the petty officer asked, checking a clipboard. That's me, Morgan replied, intentionally softening her normally commanding tone. Welcome to San Diego, ma'am. I'm Petty Officer Ramirez. I'll be driving you to Jefferson Bay. He reached for her duffel bag, seeming surprised by its weight. Morgan allowed a small, self-deprecating smile. Books, can't travel without them. What Ramirez couldn't know was that beneath the carefully selected civilian clothes in her bag lay a custom M1911 pistol, a graduation gift from her father when she completed Annapolis, in specialized communications equipment that would allow her secure contact with Admiral Harrison if necessary. The drive to the base took 45 minutes, during which Morgan maintained the persona of an eager but slightly nervous lieutenant, asking Ramirez general questions about the base that any new transfer might pose. Through his answers, she began forming her first impressions of Jefferson Bay's internal culture. Low morale disguised as cynical humor, casual mentions of equipment shortages, thinly veiled references to leadership problems. Jefferson Bay Naval Base stretched along 3 miles of Pacific coastline, its piers accommodating everything from nuclear submarines to aircraft carriers. As they approached the main gate, Morgan carefully noted the security procedures, or rather, their laxity. The gate guard barely glanced at her temporary identification before waving them through. No vehicle inspection, no verification call, nothing approaching the security protocols such an installation should maintain. Strike one, Morgan thought, maintaining her outward appearance of casual observation while mentally cataloging the security failure. Ramirez drove her to the Personnel Processing Center, a weathered building that had clearly seen better decades. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pallor over the worn furnishings and outdated equipment. Lieutenant Hayes reporting for processing, Morgan told the chief petty officer behind the main desk, handing over her transfer documents. The paperwork had been meticulously prepared by Pentagon staff to appear legitimate while containing deliberately vague details about her previous assignments. Chief Petty Officer Martinez barely looked up from her computer. Another Norfolk transfer, that's the 3rd this month. She took Morgan's papers with the weariness of someone who had processed thousands of new arrivals. ID card, Morgan presented her carefully crafted temporary identification. Martinez glanced at it for approximately 2 seconds before stamping forms in triplicate. The entire security verification process, which should have involved multiple checks and systems, was completed in under 5 minutes. Strike 2, Morgan noted mentally. You'll be in junior officers' quarters, building Charlie. Orientation is tomorrow at 0800 in the main conference room. Martinez handed over a base map with perfunctory directions and a temporary key card. Next, Morgan collected her duffel and stepped outside, consulting the base map. As she walked toward her assigned quarters, she observed the overall condition of the installation. Peeling paint on administrative buildings, uniformed personnel standing in smoking areas during duty hours, a supply truck idling near a warehouse, while sailors manually checked inventory against clipboards rather than using electronic systems. The junior officers' quarters were a 3-story concrete structure with all the charm of a Soviet-era apartment block. Morgan's assigned room was small but functional. A narrow bed, metal desk, basic bathroom, and a window overlooking a training field. She unpacked efficiently, arranging her civilian clothes in the provided dresser while securing her pistol and communications equipment in a specially designed false bottom in her duffel. Sitting at the desk, Morgan opened Harrison's notebook, reviewing the techniques they had developed during Cold War intelligence operations. One passage stood out. The true measure of an installation isn't what officials show you, but what happens in the mess hall after hours and in the maintenance shops when supervisors are absent. Listen more than you speak. Watch routines and disruptions equally. The anomalies will reveal the truth. Following this advice, Morgan headed to the officers' mess for dinner. The large cafeteria buzzed with conversation and the clatter of trays. She took her place in line, selecting what appeared to be baked chicken, mashed potatoes, and something allegedly vegetable adjacent. Finding an empty seat at a table occupied by other junior officers, she introduced herself with the rehearsed backstory. Lieutenant Hayes, just in from Norfolk. A lanky lieutenant commander nodded in greeting. Stevens Communications. Norfolk, huh? How's the Atlantic treating our East Coast brethren? Morgan gave the appropriately vague responses expected of a new transfer, then fell into the role of the attentive listener as conversation flowed around her. Within 15 minutes, she had gathered more actionable intelligence than formal reports had provided in months. Supplies a complete nightmare since Bennett took over. A lieutenant junior grade complained poking at his dessert. Requisitioned standard encryption modules 2 months ago. Still waiting. Better than communications, Stevens countered. Half our systems are running on components that should have been replaced during the Obama administration. Cole's been filing priority requests for the AN-SPS 73 upgrade for 8 months now. And meanwhile, Wilson's Pacific Command keeps sending these readiness assessments like we can magically fix everything with better paperwork, another officer added with unmistakable bitterness. Morgan mentally flagged 3 names: Bennett in Supply, Cole in Communications, and Wilson at Pacific Command. The connections were already forming in her tactical mind. After dinner, she took a strategic walk around the base perimeter, using the evening exercise period as cover for her reconnaissance. The physical security measures were adequate: proper fencing, regular patrol patterns, surveillance coverage, but she identified at least 3 blind spots that a determined intruder could exploit. More concerning was the general atmosphere of the base. Where elite installations typically hummed with purposeful energy, Jefferson Bay exhibited a pervasive lethargy. Personnel moved without urgency. Maintenance crews took extended breaks. Even the watch officers at key positions seemed to be going through the motions rather than maintaining vigilant readiness. As darkness fell, Morgan returned to her quarters, mentally composing her initial assessment. Jefferson Bay wasn't merely suffering from inefficiency, it showed all the signs of systematic degradation. Whether from corruption, incompetence, or some combination remained to be determined. She pulled out her secure phone and composed a text to the number Harrison had provided using their prearranged code system. Weather upon arrival: overcast with significant pressure drop. Local forecast predicts deteriorating conditions. The response came moments later. Understood. Barometric readings noted. Proceed with full meteorological survey. Morgan allowed herself a tight smile. 5 days to map the dysfunction of an entire naval base. Harrison had taught her to approach such challenges methodologically, starting with the operational nerve centers. Tomorrow would begin with logistics and communications, the lifeblood of any military installation. Sleep came easily to Morgan, years of naval training having conditioned her to rest when possible before critical operations. Her dreams, however, were filled with her father's voice recounting lessons from his own command experiences. The strength of a chain of command isn't measured by how well it functions when observed, but by what happens when no one's watching. Morgan reported to orientation promptly at Loro 800, joining 24 other new personnel in the main conference room. The session was conducted by Lieutenant Commander Phillips, a harried-looking administrative officer, who seemed more concerned with completing the presentation than ensuring understanding. Welcome to Jefferson Bay Naval Base, Phillips began, his monotone voice suggesting this was his least favorite duty. You'll find all essential information in your welcome packets. Medical services are in Building Lima. Recreation facilities are listed on page 12. Liberty policies are on page 15. Morgan scanned the room, noting the glazed expressions of other attendees. Information critical to base operations was being presented with all the enthusiasm of a rental car agreement, virtually guaranteeing that important details would be missed or forgotten. After the perfunctory orientation, Morgan reported to her temporary assignment in the logistics department. The sprawling office occupied the first floor of the administration building, its space divided into cubicles where harried personnel juggled phones and computer screens. Major Elena Rivera. The department head was a sharp-featured woman in her late 30s whose expression suggested perpetual disappointment with the world's failure to meet her standards. She greeted Morgan with a quick assessment glance. "Lieutenant Hayes, Norfolk, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Morgan replied with appropriate deference. "You're temporary until your permanent assignment is determined. We're shorthanded in requisition processing. You'll work with Petty Officer Williams tracking outstanding orders." Rivera gestured toward a cubicle where a young sailor was already drowning in paperwork. "Any questions?" "No, ma'am," Morgan responded, projecting the eagerness of a junior officer wanting to make a good impression. "Good. The base inspection is in 3 weeks. Pacific Command is breathing down our necks about supply discrepancies. We need all hands focused." Rivera's tone made it clear that focused was the minimum acceptable standard. As Morgan settled at the assigned desk, she began the meticulous work of tracking requisition forms, a mind-numbing task for most officers, but a goldmine of intelligence for her purpose. Each form told a story: what equipment was prioritized, what languished in backlog, where funding was allocated or denied. Patterns emerged quickly. Critical communication components consistently delayed. Expensive electronic systems requisitioned, but never deployed on base. Maintenance supplies requested multiple times due to mysterious processing errors. By lunchtime, Morgan had identified a disturbing pattern: high-value electronic components, particularly those with potential civilian applications, showed the highest rate of delivery anomalies. This wasn't random inefficiency. The statistical clustering suggested deliberate manipulation. During her lunch break, Morgan made her way to the communications center, ostensibly to inquire about base phone setup for new personnel. The facility was housed in a more secure building, requiring her temporary ID card for access. At least some security protocols were being maintained. Inside, she found an operation that should have been state-of-the-art, but instead resembled a technological museum. Sailors worked with equipment that belonged to the previous decade, jury-rigging solutions to maintain operations. Chief Warrant Officer Cole, a man in his early 40s with prematurely graying hair and the intense focus of someone perpetually solving crises, directed the controlled chaos from a central desk. "Can I help you, Lieutenant?" he asked, noticing Morgan's presence. "Just arrived from Norfolk, sir. Checking on communication setup procedures for newcomers." She offered the practiced explanation. Cole ran a hand through his hair. "Norfolk, huh? You were probably spoiled with actual functioning equipment there." His frustration was evident. "Forms are over there, but fair warning, internal lines have been glitchy since the last software update. We're waiting on replacement and routing modules. Have been for about 3 months." Morgan nodded sympathetically. "Supply chain issues. That's the official explanation," Cole replied with barely concealed skepticism. "Between you and me, Lieutenant, things have a way of disappearing between requisition and delivery around here, especially anything with a chip in it." Morgan filed this confirmation of her suspicions, asking a few more routine questions before thanking Cole and departing. As she left the communications center, she nearly collided with a man in his 50s, wearing Senior Chief Petty Officer insignia. His weathered face and watchful eyes suggested decades of service. "Pardon me, sir," Morgan apologized, stepping aside. The Senior Chief studied her with unexpected intensity. "New on base, Lieutenant." "Yes, sir. Morgan Hayes, just in from Norfolk." "Senior Chief Michael Walker, Vehicle Maintenance Division." His handshake was firm, his assessment gaze lingering a moment too long. "Hayes, unusual name in the Navy." Morgan maintained her cover persona, offering a self-deprecating smile. "Not as unusual as you might think, sir." Walker nodded slowly. "Welcome to Jefferson Bay, Lieutenant. Word of advice: keep your eyes open and your expectations low. Things work differently here." There was something in his tone, a mixture of resignation and warning, that caught Morgan's attention. This wasn't merely the cynicism of a long-serving enlisted man. It was the cautious communication of someone who had observed problems but lacked the authority to address them. "I appreciate the heads up, Senior Chief," Morgan replied. Walker gave a final appraising look. "Norfolk, you said. Interesting coincidence. I served with an Admiral Hayes out of Norfolk back in Desert Storm. Good man, understood the real meaning of leadership." Morgan felt a momentary tightening in her chest at the mention of her father, but maintained her neutral expression. Common name, sir. Indeed. Walker's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Carry on, Lieutenant. The encounter left Morgan with the distinct impression that Senior Chief Walker might be sharper than his position suggested. She made a mental note to observe him further. Returning to the logistics department, Morgan spent the afternoon processing requisition forms, strategically selecting those that matched the pattern of anomalies that she'd identified. By 1600 hours, she had compiled a substantial data set that confirmed her initial suspicions, equipment worth millions of dollars, had been systematically misdirected over the past 18 months. As she was completing her shift, a commotion erupted near Major Rivera's office. Captain Bennett from the supply department, a square-built man with thinning hair and an expensive watch that seemed incongruous with his uniform, was engaged in a heated discussion with Rivera. These discrepancies are unacceptable, Captain Rivera insisted, her voice carrying across the open office. The Murphy nearly had a collision because of faulty navigation equipment that was supposedly replaced last quarter. Where are the components? Bennett's response was too low to hear clearly, but his dismissive body language spoke volumes. Rivera's face flushed with barely contained anger as she held up a folder. These requisitions were approved and allegedly fulfilled. Pacific Command will be all over this during the inspection. I need answers, not excuses. The confrontation ended with Bennett storming out, brushing past Morgan without acknowledgement. Rivera remained in her doorway, her expression a study in frustrated professionalism. Noticing Morgan, she straightened her uniform jacket. Something you need, Lieutenant. Just finishing the requisition tracking, ma'am, Morgan replied. Rivera nodded curtly. Leave the files on William's desk. He'll continue tomorrow. She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, what did you make of the processing system, Hayes' professional assessment? Morgan seized the opportunity, carefully calibrating her response to be honest without revealing too much. The system has some unusual patterns, ma'am, particularly in high-value electronics tracking. Something flickered in Rivera's eyes, recognition, perhaps even validation. Patterns. That's a diplomatic way of putting it. She glanced around the office, then made a decision. 0700 tomorrow, my office. I have some additional files that need review. Yes, ma'am, Morgan acknowledged, recognizing the invitation for what it was, a potential ally reaching out. That evening, Morgan joined a group of officers at the base recreation center, participating in a poker game that provided perfect cover for gathering intelligence. As cards were dealt and meaningless dollars exchanged hands, conversation flowed freely, lubricated by off-duty candor and beer. Did you hear about the Murphy? A lieutenant from operations asked, discarding 2 cards. Nearly kissed the pier during approach last month. Navigation system went haywire. Maintenance failures across the board, another officer added. My division requested basic diagnostic equipment 3 times this year. Always the same answer, processing delay. A junior lieutenant leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. You know, Bennett's sporting a new Rolex on a captain's salary must have one hell of an investment portfolio. Morgan played her cards carefully, both literally and figuratively, maintaining the persona of the interested newcomer while absorbing every detail. By the time she folded her final hand and bid the group good night, she had a much clearer picture of Jefferson Bay's dysfunction. Returning to her quarters, Morgan secured the door and retrieved her hidden communications device. Using the secure channel, she provided Harrison with her Day 1 assessment. Weather system more complex than initially reported. Barometric pressure indicates organized pattern, not random fluctuations. Key observation stations compromised. Local instrument Bennett showing anomalous readings. Senior forecaster Rivera may provide additional data. Historical observer Walker warrants further investigation. Harrison's response was immediate. Continue meteorological survey. Focus on electronic measuring equipment tomorrow. Satellite imagery suggests storm formation larger than anticipated. Authorization granted for limited instrument calibration if necessary. Morgan acknowledged the instructions, understanding the subtext. Harrison was confirming her authority to begin building alliances with key personnel if she deemed it necessary. The storm reference suggested the corruption might extend beyond Bennett to higher levels. Before sleeping, Morgan reviewed her mental catalog of the day's observations, applying the analytical framework Harrison's notebook had outlined. The pattern was becoming clear. Jefferson Bay wasn't merely suffering from incompetence or random corruption. The systematic nature of the discrepancies, particularly in high-value electronics, suggested an organized operation with potential connections to Pacific Command. She thought of Senior Chief Walker's comment about her father. Had he genuinely recognized the name coincidence, or was there something more to his scrutiny, William Hayes had been known for his zero tolerance of corruption. If Walker had served with him, perhaps he recognized something of the father and the daughter. Morning arrived with military punctuality. Morgan reported to Rivera's office at precisely 0700, finding the major already reviewing documents with intense concentration. "Close the door, Lieutenant," Rivera instructed without looking up. Morgan complied, standing at parade rest until Rivera gestured to a chair. "What I'm about to show you doesn't leave this room," Rivera began, her voice low despite the early hour and empty office. "I've been tracking discrepancies in our supply chain for 8 months. Components requisitioned, funding, allocated delivery confirmed, but the equipment never reaches its intended units." She pushed a folder across the desk. Inside were meticulously documented cases of missing equipment, primarily high-end electronics with both military and civilian applications. "The total value," Morgan asked, maintaining her lieutenant persona while rapidly calculating figures. "Conservative estimate, $2.5 million, and that's just what I've been able to track." Rivera's expression was grim. "I've reported through proper channels 3 times. Each report mysteriously fails to reach command review." Morgan studied the documentation, noting Rivera's methodical approach. "You suspect deliberate diversion rather than administrative error." "I don't suspect, Lieutenant. I know." Rivera tapped the folder. "These aren't random losses. There's a pattern, specific types of equipment, predictable timing, consistent documentation anomalies. Someone's skimming valuable components and covering their tracks." "Captain Bennett," Morgan suggested, recalling yesterday's confrontation. Rivera's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're perceptive for a new transfer, Hayes." She leaned back, studying Morgan with renewed interest. "Bennett's involved, certainly, but this operation is too sophisticated for him to manage alone. There's higher-level protection." The implication hung in the air between them. "Pacific Command oversight, Admiral Wilson." "Why show me this, Major?" Morgan asked directly. "I'm temporary assignment, unknown quantity, no established trust." Rivera's laugh held no humor. "That's exactly why. Everyone else has been here long enough to be either complicit or cowed into silence. You're the first new officer in months with a background in logistics systems who isn't part of the established hierarchy." Morgan recognized the moment for what it was, a critical decision point. Rivera was taking an enormous professional risk by sharing her suspicions with a lieutenant she barely knew. Either the major was extremely desperate or she possessed exceptional judgment of character. "What do you need from me?" Morgan asked, making her decision. Fresh eyes. Independent verification. "I need to know I'm not missing something obvious before I take this hire, potentially ending my career if I'm wrong." Rivera's expression was resolute. "These discrepancies threaten operational readiness. The Murphy incident proved that. Next time we might not be so lucky." Morgan nodded, accepting the assignment while calculating how to leverage this unexpected alliance. "I'll need access to the complete requisition database, not just the processed forms." "Already arranged." Rivera handed over an access card. "Use Terminal 7 in the back office. It's isolated from the main system monitoring. Review these files by tomorrow. If you confirm my findings, we move to Phase 2. "Phase 2, Morgan inquired. Rivera's expression hardened. "Bringing in Naval Criminal Investigative Service. This goes beyond administrative problems. Someone's selling military technology, and they're doing it right under our noses." As Morgan left Rivera's office, the implications crystallized. She had uncovered not merely inefficiency or minor corruption, but what appeared to be an organized technology theft operation operating within one of America's most important naval installations. The potential national security implications were staggering. Morgan spent the morning analyzing Rivera's data using Terminal 7 as instructed. The evidence was compelling. Components critical to advanced weapon systems, communications equipment, and navigation technology had been systematically diverted over an 18-month period. The documentation showed perfect paperwork, requisitions, approved funding, allocated delivery confirmed, but the physical items never reached their intended units. More disturbing were the downstream effects. The USS Murphy's near collision was directly traceable to navigation system failures caused by substandard replacement components. Communications outages had affected coordination during 3 training exercises. Weapons targeting systems on 2 vessels had shown unexplained accuracy degradation. This wasn't merely theft for profit. The pattern suggested deliberate degradation of operational capabilities. As she compiled her findings, Morgan heard a familiar voice behind her. "Finding our system interesting, Lieutenant." She turned to find Senior Chief Walker standing in the doorway, his weathered face unreadable. Just processing requisitions, Senior Chief, Morgan replied casually, minimizing the screen. Walker stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Requisitions on an isolated terminal that's not connected to the main processing system must be fascinating paperwork. Morgan maintained her cover, but her hand instinctively moved closer to where her sidearm would normally be positioned. Special project for Major Rivera. Walker's eyes narrowed slightly. You know, Lieutenant, you remind me of someone. Same analytical focus, same way of studying a room before entering. He leaned against a filing cabinet. Admiral William Hayes had that same quality. Noticed everything, revealed nothing. Morgan felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. You mentioned serving with an Admiral Hayes yesterday. Under his command during Desert Storm, USS Princeton, he ran the tightest ship in the Gulf, zero tolerance for shortcuts or creative requisitioning, as some called it. Walker studied her intently. He had a daughter, brilliant officer by all accounts, made Admiral younger than anyone in modern naval history. The moment stretched between them tense with unspoken recognition. You're not much for poker, are you, Senior Chief? Morgan finally said, her voice deliberately calm. A hint of a smile touched Walker's weathered face. I know when someone's holding better cards than they're showing Admiral Hayes. The direct acknowledgement hung in the air. Morgan assessed her options rapidly. Denying would be pointless. Walker clearly knew exactly who she was. The question was whether he represented a threat to her mission or a potential ally. How long have you known, she asked, neither confirming nor denying his assertion. Since I saw you in the communications center. You have your father's eyes and his way of asking questions that aren't really about what they seem to be about. Walker straightened. The question isn't how I recognized you, Admiral. It's what you're doing undercover on your own base 3 days before you're supposed to officially take command. Morgan made her decision. Walker had served with her father, recognized her, and had deliberately sought her out privately rather than exposing her. That suggested trustworthiness. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. Senior Chief, she said, her voice shifting subtly from subordinate lieutenant to commanding admiral. Walker's posture instinctively straightened in response to the authority now evident in her tone. Understood, Admiral. Jefferson Bay has been showing systemic degradation for 18 months. Conventional oversight has failed to identify the cause or implement effective solutions. I'm conducting a covert assessment to establish ground truth before officially assuming command. Walker nodded slowly. Unconventional approach. Your father would have approved. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Since we're being direct, Admiral, you should know that what you're uncovering goes beyond typical supply mismanagement. There's an organized operation diverting military technology. Not just for profit, though, that's certainly part of it. You have evidence? Morgan asked. Observations. Patterns. I maintain vehicles across the base, which gives me access and legitimate reasons to be almost anywhere. Walker's expression darkened. Bennett's operation is sophisticated. Equipment disappears between official delivery and unit deployment. Documentation is perfect. Physical items vanish. Morgan considered this confirmation of her findings. You've reported these observations. A bitter smile crossed Walker's face. 3 times through proper channels. Reports mysteriously never reached command review. His words echoed Rivera's almost exactly. After the 3rd attempt, I received transfer orders to Guam, suddenly rescinded when Admiral Wilson personally intervened. The mention of Wilson again was telling. Pacific Command involvement, Morgan stated rather than asked. Walker nodded grimly. Wilson visits quarterly. Always spends time with Bennett in secured areas, always after hours. The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing. Not just a corrupt supply officer, but potential involvement from Pacific Command itself. Why are you telling me this, Senior Chief? It's a significant risk. Walker's expression softened slightly. Your father saved my life in the Gulf when our ship hit a mine. Said something I never forgot. The Navy isn't just about following orders, it's about protecting what matters even when it's difficult. This base matters, Admiral. Its mission matters. What's happening here is destroying both. Morgan studied him for a long moment, then made her decision. I need eyes and ears throughout the base. People I can trust who won't reveal my identity prematurely. I can help with that, Walker replied without hesitation. Chief Cole in communications is solid, completely trustworthy, and Major Rivera has been fighting this battle alone for months. Morgan nodded. I've already made contact with Rivera. She's sharing her findings. 3 days until your official arrival, Walker noted. What's your plan, Admiral? Continue gathering evidence. Identify all key players. Prepare for immediate implementation of corrective measures once I assume official command. Morgan's expression was resolute. This stopped Senior Chief, completely and permanently. Walker's weathered face showed the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Like I said, you remind me of your father. He straightened to attention. How can I assist, Admiral? As Walker departed with his instructions, Morgan turned back to the terminal, her mind processing this significant development. She now had two allies, Rivera in logistics and Walker in maintenance. Both had independently identified the same pattern of corruption with the same apparent protection from higher authority. The puzzle pieces were aligning, but the complete picture remained elusive. What exactly was Bennett doing with the diverted equipment? How extensive was Wilson's involvement? And most critically, was this merely profit-driven corruption or something that threatened national security more directly? Morgan accessed the secure communications device hidden in her quarters through an encrypted remote connection. Her message to Harrison was concise: weather system identified, organized pattern confirmed, local instruments Bennett and Wilson showing coordinated anomalies. Have secured additional observation stations Rivera and Walker. Request permission to expand meteorological team to include Station Cole. Harrison's response came within minutes. Permission granted. Satellite imagery confirms Pacific origin disturbance. Preparations underway for rapid intervention when you assume official weather station command. Proceed with all necessary calibrations. Morgan acknowledged the authorization, understanding that Harrison was mobilizing resources for immediate action once she officially took command. The next 48 hours would be critical for gathering definitive evidence and identifying all participants in the corruption network. As she prepared to leave the terminal, Morgan's attention was drawn to a requisition file she hadn't previously examined. The document detailed a $2.5 million purchase of advanced encryption modules critical for secure communications with deployed naval vessels. According to the paperwork, the components had been delivered 3 months ago. According to Communications Officer Cole, they were still awaiting delivery. Morgan opened the delivery verification document, studying the digital signature. The authorizing officer wasn't Bennett, but Lieutenant Sean Parker, Bennett's executive officer. This suggested a division of responsibilities within the corruption network, Bennett managing the overall operation, Parker handling documentation. She made a mental note to observe Parker closely. Executive officers often had access to information their superiors didn't share broadly. If Parker could be isolated from Bennett, he might provide a vulnerability in the network structure. The pieces were falling into place, but Morgan knew from her father's teachings and her own experience that in operations like this, the most dangerous moments came just before exposure. Bennett, Parker, Wilson, if they suspected they were being investigated, they would take immediate action to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses. Time was running short. 3 days until her official arrival. 3 days to gather enough evidence to dismantle an entrenched corruption network that reached to the highest levels of Pacific Command. Morgan Hayes, Lieutenant, by cover Admiral, by rank investigator, by necessity, closed the terminal and prepared for her next move. The true test of leadership wasn't commanding from a position of established authority, but taking decisive action when the stakes were highest and resources most limited. Her father had taught her that. Now, in the shadow of his legacy, she would put that lesson into practice. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jefferson Bay Naval Base as Morgan Hayes began her 3rd day undercover. The weight of her discoveries pressed upon her with greater urgency than the duffel bag slung over her shoulder. In less than 72 hours, she would officially assume command as Admiral Hayes. Until then, she remained Lieutenant Hayes, watching, gathering intelligence, and building the case that would soon send shockwaves through the Navy's command structure. Morgan entered the logistics office at 06:45, 15 minutes before her scheduled meeting with Major Rivera. The early hour ensured minimal personnel present, allowing for more discreet conversation. She found the Major already at her desk, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting a night spent reviewing files rather than sleeping. "You look like you could use this," Morgan said, placing a cup of strong black coffee on the desk. Rivera accepted it with a grateful nod. "I was up until 0200 cross-referencing inventory discrepancies." She slid a folder across the desk, voice lowered despite the empty office. 3 months of missing encryption modules, valued at $2.5 million. Documentation shows delivery and receipt, but Cole in Communications confirms they never arrived. The signatures or perfect routine inspection would never catch it. Morgan scanned the documents, noting Lieutenant Parker's authorization signature. "Parker handles the documentation." "Bennett's right hand," Rivera confirmed. former intelligence officer before transferring to supply, expert in documentation protocols. She took a long sip of coffee. Too perfect, really. That's what first caught my attention. No errors, no corrections, no variations in processing times. Statistically impossible in normal operations. Morgan nodded, processing this confirmation of her suspicions. I need to see the physical supply chain, warehouse operations, delivery protocols, security measures. Warehouse inspections today at 1,000. Quarterly inventory verification. Rivera's expression remained professional, but her eyes conveyed the opportunity this presented. As acting logistics liaison, you have legitimate reasons to observe. Perfect, Morgan replied. She hesitated, then made a calculated risk. I met Senior Chief Walker yesterday. He seems to share your concerns about supply discrepancies. Rivera's eyebrow raised slightly. Walker has been here 20 years, knows every inch of this base. If he's talking to you about concerns, she left the implication hanging. He seems trustworthy. Morgan offered, testing Rivera's reaction. One of the few, Rivera confirmed. Walker, Cole, and communications, maybe a handful of others. The rest are either complicit or intimidated into silence. Morgan nodded, another piece falling into place. The warehouse inspection, will Bennett be there? Bennett and Parker both. Full departmental review before Pacific Command's inspection next week. Rivera's expression darkened. Admiral Wilson is personally conducting the inspection. Third time this year he's visited, unusual for someone at his level to take such interest in routine logistics. The mention of Wilson again strengthened the connection Morgan was tracing. I'll be there, she promised, standing to leave. Thank you for the coffee, Major. Lieutenant, Rivera called as Morgan reached the door. Whatever you're planning, be careful. People who ask too many questions about supply discrepancies have a way of receiving unexpected transfer orders. Morgan acknowledged the warning with a nod. Rivera's concern was genuine, though she couldn't know that Morgan's actual rank made such threats considerably less effective. Leaving the logistics office, Morgan made her way to the communications center, ostensibly to follow up on her base phone setup. The facility buzzed with morning activity as Chief Warrant Officer Cole directed operations from his central station, looking as harried as he had the previous day. Lieutenant Hayes, he greeted her, recognizing her from yesterday's visit. Your phone issue's resolved. Still working on it, Morgan replied, creating the pretext for her presence. Actually, I have a few technical questions if you have a moment. Cole glanced at his watch, then at the controlled chaos around him. 2 minutes, maybe. What do you need? Morgan lowered her voice. Major Rivera mentioned concerns about missing encryption modules, the ANSPS 73 upgrade components. Cole's expression shifted instantly from busy professional to intense focus. Not here, he said quietly, guiding her toward a small equipment room off the main center. Once inside, surrounded by humming servers and blinking network switches, he closed the door. Rivera sent you, he asked, suspicion evident. We've been discussing supply discrepancies, Morgan confirmed, particularly high-value electronics that show as delivered but never reach their intended units. Cole studied her for a long moment, making his decision. 8 months we've been waiting for those encryption modules, critical for secure fleet communications. Without them, we're running outdated protocols with known vulnerabilities. His voice carried the frustration of a professional unable to perform his duties properly. Every month, it's a new excuse. Processing delays, routing errors, administrative reviews. But the documentation shows delivery and receipt, Morgan prompted. On paper, everything is perfect. Reality. Cole gestured to the aging equipment racks. We're patching systems that should have been upgraded years ago. During last month's Pacific exercises, we had 3 communications failures. Ships couldn't coordinate properly. In a real combat situation, he left the dire consequences unspoken. Morgan nodded, understanding the operational impact. The Murphy incident, partial navigation failure due to substandard replacement components, Cole confirmed. Not the original manufacturer specs. Aftermarket parts masquerading as military-grade equipment. His expression hardened. Someone's deliberately degrading our capabilities while pocketing the difference in component costs. The pattern was becoming clearer, not just theft for profit, but systematic degradation of critical systems. Who has the authority to make these substitutions? Morgan asked. On paper, multiple verification points, independent quality control. Cole's bitter laugh held no humor. Reality Bennett's supply department handles all verification. His people sign off on component specifications. His people verify installations. And Lieutenant Parker, Bennett's shadow, former intelligence, handles all the documentation. Never seen him in an engine room or looking at actual equipment. Cole checked his watch. I need to get back. Communications check with the fleet in 5 minutes. Morgan thanked him and departed her tactical mind, processing the additional confirmation. Bennett, Parker, and somehow Wilson from Pacific Command formed the core of what appeared to be not merely a corruption scheme, but a deliberate effort to degrade operational capabilities. The implications extended beyond criminal. This was potentially treasonous. At 09:45, Morgan arrived at the main supply warehouse for the inventory inspection. The massive structure housed everything from office supplies to critical electronic components, all categorized and tracked through the Navy's inventory management system. In theory, at least. She positioned herself with the logistics observer's clipboard in hand, maintaining the appearance of a junior officer performing routine duties. The warehouse hummed with pre-inspection activity as personnel conducted last-minute checks in organized display areas. The atmosphere carried the familiar tension of subordinates preparing for superior officer scrutiny. At precisely 1,000 hours, Captain Bennett entered, accompanied by Lieutenant Parker. Bennett moved with the confident stride of a man accustomed to authority, his uniform immaculate, his bearing proper, but somehow hollow the performance of military discipline rather than its embodiment. Parker followed 2 steps behind, younger and leaner, with the watchful eyes of someone cataloging details. Morgan observed them carefully from her position, noting their interaction patterns. Bennett played the role of commanding officer, perfectly voiced, carrying the right mixture of authority and encouragement, posture, impeccable, technical knowledge sufficient to ask appropriate questions. Yet something about his performance struck Morgan as rehearsed, like an actor who had studied military leadership rather than lived it. Parker was more interesting. While Bennett commanded attention, Parker observed personnel reactions, occasionally making notes in a small black notebook. His gaze swept the warehouse with intelligence training, evident in his systematic coverage pattern. No detail escaped his attention, including Morgan's presence among the logistics observers. Their eyes met briefly across the warehouse floor. Parker's expression remained neutral, but Morgan recognized the assessment in his gaze, the same professional evaluation she was conducting. For a moment, Hunter recognized Hunter, though neither revealed awareness of the recognition. The inspection proceeded methodically through equipment categories, with Bennett projecting confidence and expertise throughout. When they reached the electronic components section, Morgan paid particular attention. The ANSPS-73 encryption modules, Bennett inquired of the section chief. Fully accounted for, sir, the young petty officer responded, presenting the inventory documentation. Installation status, Bennett continued. Awaiting deployment scheduling, sir. Quality control verification completed last month. Morgan controlled her expression, but mentally flagged the blatant falsehood. The modules that Cole had confirmed never arrived were apparently fully accounted for and quality control verified. The deception operated in plain sight, protected by perfect documentation and hierarchical authority. As the inspection continued, Morgan observed Bennett and Parker's movements carefully. There was a practiced efficiency to their operation, Bennett commanding attention and focus. Parker quietly noting potential problems or individuals showing too much interest in specific areas. They functioned as a coordinated team, maintaining the appearance of proper military procedure while concealing systemic corruption. Near the inspection's conclusion, Bennett approached the logistics observers, offering practice remarks about the importance of accurate inventory management. As he addressed the group, Morgan noticed Parker circulating behind them, studying faces and reactions. When he passed behind her, she felt his attention lingering longer than on others. "Lieutenant Hayes is in it?" Parker asked as the group dispersed following Bennett's remarks. Morgan turned, maintaining her cover persona. "Yes, sir. Temporary assignment to logistics while awaiting permanent placement." "Norfolk, correct." Parker's tone was conversational, but his eyes remained evaluative. "Interesting time to transfer to Jefferson Bay. 3 weeks before Pacific Command inspection." "Orders are orders, sir," Morgan replied with the appropriate deference of a junior officer. Parker nodded slowly. "Indeed, they are, Lieutenant." He studied her for a moment longer. "Major Rivera speaks highly of your attention to detail, rare quality in temporary personnel." The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. Morgan had been noticed. Her association with Rivera had been flagged. Parker was warning her or testing her reaction. "Just doing my duty, sir," Morgan responded neutrally. "Admirable," Parker said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Carry on, Lieutenant." As Parker walked away to rejoin Bennett, Morgan maintained her composed exterior while mentally recalibrating. Her investigation had attracted attention sooner than anticipated. Parker's intelligence background made him particularly dangerous, trained to recognize anomalies and investigate inconsistencies. After the inspection concluded, Morgan returned to the logistics office, finding Rivera reviewing the inspection documentation. Perfect inspection, Rivera noted with thinly veiled sarcasm. Every item accounted for, every system operational, no discrepancies whatsoever. Miraculous. Too perfect. Morgan agreed, closing Rivera's office door. The encryption modules, Cole confirms, never arrived, are apparently fully accounted for and quality control verified. Rivera nodded grimly. Standard procedure, documentation perfection, hiding operational deficiencies. She hesitated, then added, Parker approached you. It wasn't a question. Morgan nodded. He mentioned you're speaking highly of my attention to detail. Warning shot, Rivera confirmed. You're on their radar now. Parker doesn't make casual conversation. She sighed heavily. I shouldn't have involved you so visibly. It's my battle, not yours. Morgan maintained her lieutenant persona while inwardly acknowledging the irony. What happens next? They'll investigate you, background check, previous assignments, communication patterns. Rivera's expression was grim. They're thorough haze, and they have connections beyond this base. Morgan nodded, understanding the implications. Her cover identity would withstand cursory examination, but intensive investigation might reveal discrepancies. The timeline had accelerated. She needed to gather conclusive evidence before Parker's suspicions triggered deeper scrutiny. I need to see the actual delivery process, Morgan said. How components physically arrive and move through the base. Rivera hesitated. That's significantly more dangerous than reviewing documentation. It's the missing piece, Morgan insisted. The paperwork shows a perfect process. I need to observe the reality. After a moment's consideration, Rivera nodded. Supply transport arrives tomorrow at 0800. High-priority electronic components for the Pacific Fleet exercise next month. She wrote a notation on her clipboard. You're now officially assigned to delivery verification. It gives you legitimate reasons to observe the entire process. Thank you, Major, Morgan said, genuinely appreciative of Rivera's continued assistance despite increasing risk. Be careful, Hayes, Rivera replied. Parker doesn't miss much, and Bennett has powerful friends. As Morgan left the logistics office, she felt eyes tracking her movement across the base. Whether actual surveillance or heightened awareness of her vulnerable position, the sensation reinforced the accelerating timeline. She had attracted attention. Now she needed to convert that liability into an advantage. Rather than returning directly to her quarters, Morgan made a deliberate detour to the vehicle maintenance facility. Senior Chief Walker had mentioned his position provided access throughout the base. She needed his knowledge of base security and movement patterns. The maintenance facility echoed with the sounds of engines and tools as sailors and civilian contractors worked on everything from Humvees to specialized equipment transporters. Morgan spotted Walker supervising repairs on a command vehicle, his weathered hands demonstrating proper maintenance technique to a young sailor. Walker noticed her entrance immediately, his expression remaining professionally neutral as he completed his instruction. Once finished, he approached Morgan with the appropriate formality their respective ranks would dictate. Lieutenant Hayes, something I can help you with. Morgan nodded toward a quieter corner of the facility. A few questions about vehicle maintenance schedules, Senior Chief. Once they were relatively private, surrounded by the noise of machinery that would cover conversation, Morgan spoke quietly. I've been assigned to delivery verification for tomorrow's supply transport. 0800 arrival electronic components. Walker's expression revealed nothing, but his eyes sharpened with interest. Important assignment for a temporary officer. Parker approached me after the warehouse inspection. Made it clear I've been noticed. Walker absorbed this information with a slight nod. Not surprising. You've been asking the right questions to the right people. He lowered his voice further. Parker's dangerous. Former intelligence. Specialized in counterintelligence operations before mysteriously transferring to supply 3 years ago. Exactly when the supply discrepancies began, Morgan noted. Precisely. Walker glanced around, ensuring their conversation remained private. Tomorrow's delivery is significant. Advanced targeting systems for the Pacific Fleet exercise. If the pattern holds, the documentation will show perfect delivery while actual systems are compromised. I need to see the entire process, Morgan explained. From arrival through verification to storage. Walker considered this, then made a decision. The transport will arrive at Pier 7, Components transferred to secure vehicles, then transported to the high-value storage facility behind the main warehouse. He reached for a grease-stained clipboard sketching a quick map. Standard procedure routes vehicles here, here, and here. Security checkpoints at these locations. Camera coverage throughout except these blind spots. Morgan studied the diagram, committing it to memory. Security protocols. ID verification at checkpoints. Two-person authentication for high-value transfers. All by the book on paper. Walker's expression darkened. Reality is different. Personnel recognize Bennett's people wave them through. Security cameras experience maintenance issues during critical transfers. How do the actual components disappear? Morgan asked, identifying the crucial gap in her understanding. Walker pointed to a location on his improvised map. Transfer point between delivery and secure storage. Components are verified against shipping manifests, then moved to military transport vehicles. That's where the switch happens. Original components, diverted replacement, or counterfeit components continue to storage with perfect documentation. Morgan nodded, the operational picture becoming clearer. I need legitimate reasons to be present at that transfer point. Walker thought for a moment, then indicated another location. Maintenance inspection point. All vehicles require safety certification before entering secure areas. As logistics liaison, you can reasonably request observation of the entire process, including transport safety verification. Can you ensure I have access to that inspection point? I'm the senior certification officer, Walker confirmed with a slight smile. I can assign personnel as needed. Morgan felt a moment of genuine appreciation for the senior chief's assistance. This is significant risk, Senior Chief. Walker's weathered face showed resolve rather than concern. With respect, Lieutenant, I've served the Navy for 27 years. What's happening here dishonors everything the service stands for. He straightened slightly. Your father understood that some principles matter more than personal risk. Morgan nodded, accepting his commitment. Tomorrow then, 0800 at Pier 7. I'll ensure you have access to the entire process, Walker promised. Just be careful. Bennett and Parker have eyes everywhere. As Morgan departed the maintenance facility, her tactical mind processed the additional intelligence. Tomorrow would provide the opportunity to witness the actual theft and process the critical evidence needed to build an irrefutable case. The risk had increased substantially, but so had the potential reward. Evening found Morgan in the officers' club, maintaining her cover by participating in the social rituals expected of a junior officer. The informal setting provided cover for observation while establishing her presence in normal activities. If Parker was investigating, her visible participation in routine social functions would help reinforce her cover identity. As she nursed a single beer, contributing occasionally to casual conversation about base operations and career trajectories, Morgan surveyed the room with practiced nonchalance. Officers from various departments mingled in the comfortable space, conversations flowing more freely than during duty hours. Near the bar, she spotted Parker in civilian clothes engaged in conversation with two officers Morgan didn't recognize. Though appearing relaxed, Parker's attention remained alert, his gaze periodically sweeping the room with professional assessment. Several times his eyes passed over Morgan's position, never lingering, but clearly registering her presence. Morgan maintained her role, perfectly projecting the appropriate mix of professionalism and off-duty relaxation expected of a junior officer. When a communications lieutenant invited her to join a poker game, she accepted with appropriate enthusiasm, using the opportunity to gather additional intelligence from casual conversation. Supply's been a mess since Bennett took over, the lieutenant commented as he dealt cards. Requisitions take twice as long, half the equipment never arrives, and somehow the paperwork is always perfect. But don't mention that during inspections, another officer added with knowing cynicism. Last ensign, who questioned discrepancies, found himself reassigned to a Dak, Alaska within a week. Parker's the one you really need to watch, a third officer contributed, voice lowered. Bennett's just a figurehead. Parker runs the actual operation. Morgan played her cards carefully, both literally and figuratively, participating in the conversation without showing undue interest in supply operations. As the evening progressed, she noted Parker departing the officers' club, accompanied by one of the officers he'd been speaking with earlier. After finishing the poker game, intentionally breaking even to avoid drawing attention, Morgan made her way back to her quarters. The base had transitioned to night operations, lighting reduced to operational minimums, personnel movement decreased to essential functions. As she walked the darkened pathways between buildings, Morgan maintained heightened awareness, conscious that her activities had attracted unwelcome attention. Near the junior officer's quarters, she detected movement in her peripheral vision, a shadow detaching from a building, moving parallel to her path. Training and instinct took over. Morgan altered her route slightly, creating an opportunity to verify whether the movement was coincidental or deliberate surveillance. The shadow adjusted course, maintaining consistent distance while tracking her movements. Confirmation of surveillance. Morgan continued walking, mentally mapping the base layout and identifying potential confrontation points. If this was Parker's operation, the goal was likely information gathering rather than direct intervention. If it was someone else, someone less controlled, the situation could escalate unpredictably. As she approached a narrow passage between buildings, Morgan made her decision. Rather than continuing to her quarters under surveillance, she would confront the situation directly, control the engagement on her terms rather than remaining reactive. She deliberately slowed her pace, allowing the shadow to close distance slightly, then abruptly turned down the narrow passage. Once out of direct sight, as she pressed herself against the wall in darkness, waiting. Military training had prepared her for precisely such tactical situations, though she hadn't anticipated needing those skills while on an American naval base. The shadow followed moments later, hesitating at the passage entrance. Morgan remained motionless, controlling her breathing, blending with the darkness. As the figure advanced cautiously into the passage, features became discernible: male, military bearing, hand positioned near what appeared to be a concealed weapon. When the figure drew parallel to her position, Morgan acted. Years of close-quarters combat training executed with practiced efficiency. A precise strike to the solar plexus disrupted breathing, followed by a sweeping leg maneuver that destabilized balance. Before her pursuer could recover, Morgan had him pinned against the opposite wall, forearm pressed against his throat with calculated pressure, restrictive without causing injury. "Why are you following me?" she demanded, voice low and controlled. Recognition dawned as she identified her pursuer, one of the enlisted personnel from the supply department. Fear registered in his eyes as he struggled ineffectively against her hold. "Lieutenant Parker's orders," he gasped against the pressure on his throat. "Watch your movements, report your contacts." "Since when does supply conduct surveillance on base personnel?" Morgan pressed, maintaining control while extracting information. "Special security protocols," the man managed. "High-value assets protection." Morgan adjusted her hold slightly, allowing clearer speech while maintaining dominance. "What specific concerns about me?" "Unusual interest in supply chain verification. Too many questions about electronic components." Fear made him talkative, self-preservation overriding operational security. "Parker said you might be naval intelligence investigating discrepancies." The irony of being mistaken for a much lower-level investigation than her actual identity would have been amusing under different circumstances. Morgan made a split-second decision, balancing tactical advantage against operational security. "Listen carefully," she instructed, voice carrying absolute authority despite her lieutenant's insignia. "You will report to Parker that you followed me to my quarters, observed nothing unusual, and completed your assignment as instructed." The man nodded frantically, clearly more afraid of his current situation than potential consequences from Parker. "If Parker asks why it took so long, you'll explain that I stopped to speak with the communications personnel about phone setup issues which delayed your surveillance." Another frantic nod. "If you deviate from this report in any way, if you mention this encounter, it will ensure you face charges for assaulting an officer. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," he responded, desperation evident. Morgan released her hold, maintaining readiness for any counterattack. None came. The man straightened his uniform with shaking hands, clearly unnerved by her unexpected combat proficiency. "Report to Parker as instructed," Morgan ordered. "Then reconsider your participation in operations outside normal military protocols. Careers and freedom are at stake." Without waiting for further response, Morgan departed the passage, taking an intentionally circuitous route to her quarters to verify no additional surveillance. The encounter confirmed her suspicions. Parker was actively investigating her, employing personnel in unauthorized surveillance operations. The timeline had compressed further. Tomorrow's supply delivery observation had become even more critical and more dangerous. Reaching her quarters without further incident, Morgan secured the door and retrieved her hidden communications device. The situation warranted updating Harrison directly rather than relying on their coded messaging system. "Situation accelerating," she reported once the encrypted connection was established. Bennett and Parker identified as primary operatives. Wilson from Pacific Command connected, but specific role unclear. Active surveillance initiated against me following supply warehouse inspection. Harrison's response was immediate, his voice carrying the calm assurance of decades of operational experience. Assessment of timeline. Cover likely compromised within 24-48 hours. Parker has intelligence background conducting counter-surveillance operations. I've been officially assigned to tomorrow's supply delivery verification opportunity to observe actual diversion of components. A moment's silence as Harrison calculated options. Risk assessment. Manageable, Morgan replied with honest evaluation. Operational security compromised, but physical risk minimal within base perimeter. Surveillance suggests information gathering rather than direct intervention. Extraction options. Unnecessary at present, Morgan determined. Tomorrow's observation represents critical intelligence opportunity, worth acceptable risk increase. Harrison's sigh carried through the secure connection. Your father made similar risk calculations, usually correct occasionally. He left the sentence unfinished. Proceed with delivery observation. Will accelerate command transition protocols. Be prepared for official assumption of command within 36 hours instead of 72. Understood, Morgan acknowledged, recognizing the significant adjustment to their original timeline. Additional assets available if required, Harrison added. Naval Investigative Service Team standing by. Code phrase weather station activation will deploy immediate support. Morgan confirmed the emergency protocol, then terminated the secure connection. Accelerated timeline, increased surveillance, critical observation opportunity, tomorrow. The operation had entered its most dangerous phase, the period when targets begin sensing the investigation, but before official authority could be exercised. She reviewed her mental map of the base, focusing on tomorrow's operation. Walker's diagram had identified the critical transfer point where legitimate components disappeared and counterfeit replacements continued through the system. That moment represented both the essential evidence and the point of greatest vulnerability. Bennett and Parker had conducted this operation successfully for years. They would have security measures and contingency plans for unexpected observation. As Morgan prepared for sleep, she conducted a final review of her quarters, verifying security and ensuring her weapon remained easily accessible. The transformation from routine corruption investigation to potential counterintelligence operation had raised the stakes significantly. Parker's background and Bennett's connections created an unusually sophisticated opponent for what had initially appeared to be standard military corruption. Dawn would bring the critical operation, observation of the actual theft process, documentation of the specific mechanism by which military equipment was being diverted, identification of all personnel involved. The evidence needed to dismantle not just a corruption scheme, but what increasingly appeared to be a deliberate effort to degrade American naval capabilities. Morgan Hayes, Admiral, disguised as lieutenant investigator, operating in plain sight, set her internal alarm for 0600. 6 years at Annapolis and subsequent operational deployments had conditioned her to wake precisely when needed without external assistance. As sleep approached, her tactical mind continued processing scenarios and contingency plans. Tomorrow would determine whether her unconventional approach to command transition would yield the intelligence breakthrough needed to save Jefferson Bay from the corruption eating at its core. Her father had taught her that the most dangerous opponents weren't those who confronted you directly, but those who smiled while undermining the foundations beneath your feet. Bennett and Parker had been undermining Jefferson Bay's operational capabilities for years, their actions protected by perfect documentation and high-level connections. Tomorrow, that would end. As consciousness faded toward sleep, Morgan's last thoughts weren't of operational planning or tactical positioning, but of her father's voice from years ago. The measure of leadership isn't commanding from a position of established authority, but taking decisive action when the stakes are highest and resources most limited. Tomorrow would test that principle to its fullest extent. The morning air carried the distinctive salt scent of the Pacific as Morgan Hayes approached Pier 7. Dawn had barely broken, casting long shadows across Jefferson Bay Naval Base. She had arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled 0800 delivery, giving herself time to observe pre-delivery preparations and personnel positioning. Her naval issue watch, deliberately chosen instead of the higher-end timepiece an Admiral might wear, indicated 0730 as she assumed position near the vehicle inspection point Walker had arranged for her access. Despite the early hour, the pier buzzed with activity. Sailors prepared offloading equipment, security personnel established perimeter positions, and administrative staff reviewed documentation requirements. Morgan noted the precise choreography of the operation, identifying key personnel and security protocols with practiced efficiency. Near the primary security checkpoint, she spotted Lieutenant Parker conversing with the security detail leader, gesturing toward the pier entrance. His presence confirmed the significance of this particular delivery. Adjacent to the main warehouse, Captain Bennett supervised the preparation of transport vehicles, his expression revealing none of the tension that would be expected if millions in military hardware were about to be diverted. Lieutenant Hayes, Senior Chief Walker's voice came from behind her. Your vehicle inspection credentials. Morgan accepted the clipboard and authorization form, scanning the documentation that provided her official reason to be present. Thorough work, Senior Chief. Walker nodded, his weathered face revealing nothing as he surveyed the pier activity. Inspection point is positioned with clear sight lines to the transfer area. Primary vehicle will be the third in convoy dark blue transport with reinforced cargo bay. Morgan committed the information to memory while maintaining the outward appearance of routine duty preparation. Expected timeline. Supply vessel docks at 0800. Offloading begins immediately. Components transferred to secure vehicles by 0830. Transport to high security storage scheduled for 0845. Walker's voice remained professionally neutral. Standard procedure would route convoy past maintenance inspection point at approximately 0850. Morgan nodded, understanding the operational sequence. Any changes to routine procedure? None officially communicated, Walker replied. But Bennett's people conducted unusual security sweeps of the route at 800, not standard protocol. The implication was clear: the operation might have been modified due to Morgan's known interest. Before she could respond, her attention was drawn to movement at the pier entrance. A black SUV with Pacific Command insignia had arrived, triggering heightened activity among security personnel. Wilson, Walker confirmed, quietly identifying the silver-haired Admiral who emerged from the vehicle. 3 days before scheduled inspection, never personally attends routine deliveries. Morgan watched as Wilson was greeted with appropriate ceremony by Bennett. The Admiral's presence significantly altered operational calculations. As Pacific Fleet Commander, Wilson represented the highest level of naval authority in the region and potentially the highest level of the corruption network Morgan was investigating. Proceed to inspection point, Walker advised. Maintain routine visibility. I'll ensure communications through standard channels. Morgan nodded, understanding the subtext. Her unusual combat skills displayed during last night's confrontation had potentially accelerated suspicion. Maintaining the appearance of routine duty performance was critical. As she walked toward the vehicle inspection point, Morgan observed Wilson, Bennett, and Parker entering the secured administrative building overlooking the pier. The three men moved with the comfortable familiarity of long association, their body language suggesting a relationship beyond normal command structure interaction. Morgan positioned herself at the inspection point, clipboard in hand, projecting the image of a junior officer performing routine duties. From this vantage, she had clear sight lines to both the pier offloading area and the transport staging zone. The location allowed observation of the critical transfer point Walker had identified, where legitimate components would allegedly be switched for counterfeits. At precisely 0800, the supply vessel docked at Pier 7. Its military gray hull bore standard Navy markings, though Morgan noted with interest that the vessel originated from a private contractor facility rather than a naval supply depot. The distinction was significant. Private contractors operated under different security protocols than military installations, potentially creating exploitable gaps in the verification process. Offloading began immediately, with crane operators transferring sealed containers from ship to pier. Morgan noted the efficiency of the operation, practice movements suggesting routine rather than exception. Security personnel maintained perimeter positions, though she observed they focused primarily outward rather than monitoring the actual transfer process. From her inspection point, Morgan documented each stage of the operation with meticulous attention to detail. As Walker had predicted, the third vehicle in the transport convoy, a dark blue specialized transport with reinforced cargo bay, received particular attention from Bennett's personnel. 2 senior petty officers from supply remained with this vehicle, continuously checking documentation and supervising loading preparations with greater scrutiny than given to other transports. At 0827, Morgan observed the critical moment. A sealed container marked with high security designations was transferred from the pier to the staging area. According to standard protocol, this container should have undergone verification scan before loading onto the transport vehicle. Instead, Bennett's senior petty officers diverted the container to a secondary inspection station, a small structure partially obscured from main pier sightlines. Vehicle inspection team request status update. Walker's voice came through Morgan's radio, providing pretext for communication. Inspection point 3, at all systems nominal. Morgan responded, using the routine communication to adjust her position for better observation of the secondary inspection station. Through modified positioning, Morgan witnessed the actual diversion in progress. Inside the secondary station, the sealed container was opened. Original components, the advanced targeting systems marked for Pacific Fleet deployment, were removed and placed in an unmarked storage unit. Replacement components visually similar but lacking proper military identification markings were transferred to a duplicate container bearing all original external security designations. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. The original components disappeared into the storage facility while the duplicate container continued to the transport vehicle with perfect documentation. Had Morgan not been specifically observing this precise location, the substitution would have been invisible among the routine activities surrounding the larger delivery operation. As the transport convoy prepared for departure, Morgan documented the security procedures surrounding the duplicated container. Every external protocol was followed perfectly. Security scans verified the container's official designations. Documentation recorded proper handling. Dual authentication protocols confirmed appropriate authorizations. The perfect procedural adherence would render the substitution undetectable through standard inspection methods. At 0850, the transport convoy began movement toward the high-security storage facility. As predicted, the vehicles would pass through Morgan's inspection checkpoint, providing final opportunity for observation before the evidence disappeared into secure storage. Morgan prepared for the convoy's arrival, maintaining the appearance of routine duty while preparing to document the final stage of the operation. As the vehicles approached, she noted Parker's arrival at the inspection point, his presence unexpected and concerning. Lieutenant Hayes, Parker greeted her, his tone professionally correct, while his eyes conducted thorough assessment. Interesting assignment for someone so recently arrived. Morgan maintained her cover persona clipboard positioned to shield her documentation of the suspicious container. Following Major Rivera's directive, sir, standard transport safety verification. Of course, Parker replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. Though vehicle safety seems an unusual priority for someone with your particular background. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Parker's intelligence training had clearly yielded results. He had discovered inconsistencies in her cover identity. How much he knew remained uncertain, but his presence at this critical juncture was tactical rather than coincidental. Before Morgan could respond, the convoy arrived at the inspection point. The lead vehicle stopped for standard safety verification, its driver presenting documentation for approval. Morgan maintained procedural focus, processing the paperwork while keeping Parker in her peripheral awareness. Unusual interest in specific vehicles, Lieutenant Parker asked as Morgan visually inspected the lead transport. Standard procedure covers all convoy components, sir, Morgan replied with appropriate deference. Safety protocols don't distinguish between vehicle contents. Parker nodded slowly, moving to position himself between Morgan and the approaching third vehicle, the transport containing the substituted components. His placement was deliberately obstructive, limiting her ability to document the critical evidence. Morgan adjusted position, accordingly maintaining clipboard documentation while creating angle for necessary observation. As the third vehicle reached the inspection point, she noted the security seals on the cargo area, perfect duplicates of official designations, indistinguishable from legitimate markings without specialized verification equipment. This transport has priority clearance, Parker informed her, presenting override documentation. Admiral Wilson's direct authorization. The paperwork bore appropriate Pacific Command authorization codes, official circumvention of standard inspection protocols. Under normal circumstances, such high-level intervention would prevent further verification. Morgan faced the critical decision point, maintain cover, and allow the evidence to disappear or challenge the override and potentially expose her investigation prematurely. Her decision was interrupted by the sudden appearance of Admiral Wilson himself, accompanied by Bennett in a security detail. The Admiral's presence at a routine checkpoint was unprecedented, further confirmation of the operation's significance. Lieutenant, Wilson addressed Morgan directly, his silver hair catching morning sunlight, his uniform immaculate with the 4 stars of Fleet Command prominent on his shoulders. I understand you have been taking particular interest in our supply chain procedures. The direct confrontation carried unmistakable warning. Wilson's presence represented the highest level of the corruption network, his personal intervention indicating the seriousness with which they viewed Morgan's investigation. Simply performing assigned duties, Admiral, Morgan replied with appropriate deference, mentally calculating tactical options. Her cover was clearly compromised, but without evidence of the actual component substitution, she lacked proof necessary for official action. Commendable dedication. Wilson responded, his tone suggesting exactly the opposite. However, these particular components fall under special security protocols. My authorization supersedes standard inspection requirements. Morgan recognized the carefully constructed trap. Accepting Wilson's override would allow the evidence to disappear. Challenging a four-star admiral's direct authorization would constitute insubordination from a lieutenant, providing pretext for immediate disciplinary action and removal from position. The tactical situation had deteriorated beyond recovery of the specific evidence. Morgan made the strategic decision to preserve operational capability rather than sacrifice position for incomplete proof. She examined Wilson's authorization with appropriate thoroughness, then signed the inspection waiver. Documentation appears in order, Admiral. Transport cleared to proceed. Wilson's slight smile confirmed his belief in operational victory. Carry on, Lieutenant. His emphasis on her rank carried unmistakable satisfaction. He turned to Bennett and Parker. Ensure expedited processing upon arrival. These components are critical to next week's fleet exercise. As Wilson and his entourage departed, Morgan maintained professional composure while mentally recalibrating. The direct intervention confirmed her suspicions regarding the conspiracy's reach, but had prevented documentation of the actual criminal act. Her cover identity was compromised, though the extent remained unclear. The original timeline was no longer viable. Morgan used the pretext of completing inspection paperwork to establish communication with Walker. Vehicle inspection, complete, maintenance certification filed under Protocol 7-3. The coded message would inform Walker of Wilson's direct intervention and the need for accelerated contingency implementation. Walker's acknowledgement came through standard channels, his voice revealing nothing of the operational significance. Certification received. Return to primary station for equipment return. Morgan understood the instruction report to Walker's maintenance facility rather than returning to the logistics office. As she completed final documentation and prepared to depart the inspection point, she noticed Parker observing her from distance, his posture suggesting continued surveillance rather than operational conclusion. The strategic situation had entered critical phase. Wilson's personal intervention indicated awareness of potential investigation, though his behavior suggested confidence rather than concern. He believed his rank and authority provided sufficient protection against the lieutenant's observations. What he couldn't know was that the lieutenant he had just confronted was actually an admiral with direct Pentagon authorization. Morgan proceeded to the vehicle maintenance facility, maintaining awareness of potential surveillance while following standard movement patterns. Walker's shop provided relative security, legitimate operational space with reduced monitoring compared to administrative areas. Walker was supervising engine maintenance when Morgan arrived, his greeting professionally appropriate while conveying nothing of their shared investigation. He led her to a small office adjacent to the main maintenance bay where the ambient noise of equipment provided cover for conversation. Wilson's personal intervention confirms highest level involvement, Morgan stated once the door closed. Direct circumvention of inspection protocols with Pacific Command authorization. Walker's weathered face showed grim confirmation rather than surprise. They're accelerating operations. This morning's delivery included targeting system components for next week's fleet exercise. If compromised components are deployed, the implication hung in the air, potential catastrophic failure during live fire exercises involving multiple vessels. Beyond criminal profit, the operation now suggested deliberate sabotage of naval capabilities. My cover is compromised. Morgan continued assessing operational realities. Parker has been investigating background inconsistencies. Wilson's direct intervention suggests awareness of potential investigation, though not necessarily my actual identity. Walker nodded, processing the tactical situation. Timeline. Accelerated transition necessary. Harrison has authorized command assumption within 36 hours rather than 72. Morgan's decision was tactical rather than preferential. Tonight rather than tomorrow. We've lost the element of complete surprise, but they still don't expect a lieutenant to transform into an admiral. Walker's slight smile reflected professional appreciation for the tactical approach. Recommended immediate actions. Secure evidence already gathered. Establish communication with Rivera and Cole to coordinate simultaneous documentation of discrepancies across departments. Morgan outlined the accelerated operation with practiced efficiency. Prepare for immediate security implementation upon command transfer. Wilson's presence creates jurisdictional complications, but his direct intervention provides additional evidence of involvement. Walker absorbed the instructions, adding his own operational assessment. Parker will accelerate counter-surveillance. Your movements will be tracked continuously until command ceremony. Expected and manageable, Morgan acknowledged. The official transfer ceremony remains scheduled for 1400 tomorrow. We'll implement accelerated revelation at 2000 tonight during Bennett's scheduled briefing for Wilson. Maximum operational impact with all key conspirators present simultaneously. Walker nodded approval of the tactical approach. I'll coordinate with Rivera and Cole. Secure communications only. Documentation ready for immediate transfer upon your command assumption. As Morgan departed the maintenance facility, the operational sequence was established. 8 hours until accelerated command revelation. 8 hours of maintaining lieutenant cover, while Parker's counter-surveillance undoubtedly tracked her movements. 8 hours to position assets for maximum effectiveness when her true identity and authority were revealed. The remainder of the day unfolded with increasing tension beneath the surface of routine operations. Morgan maintained her assigned duties in the logistics office, processing requisition forms with apparent focus while actually documenting the pattern of discrepancies for official evidence. Rivera provided additional files showing the systematic nature of the corruption, her actions carefully measured to avoid triggering additional suspicion. Throughout the day, Morgan noticed increased security presence around the base, personnel strategically positioned to monitor her movements. Parker's counter-surveillance operation had expanded, suggesting growing concern about her activities. The response confirmed her tactical assessment. They suspected investigation, but not her actual identity or authority. At 17:30, Morgan received expected summons to Captain Bennett's office. The meeting represented their attempt to contain potential damage through official channels using command authority to isolate and neutralize a lieutenant's observations before they could reach higher command. Bennett's office occupied prime space in the administration building, its furnishings reflecting his position and self-importance. Morgan reported as instructed, maintaining appropriate military protocol while observing details that might provide additional evidence. She noted the expensive watch on Bennett's wrist, the Rolex mentioned in Officers Club conversation, clearly beyond standard captain's salary. Lieutenant Hayes, Bennett began once she was seated, his tone balancing authority with false concern. I understand you've been conducting extensive research into our supply chain procedures. Following assigned duties, sir, Morgan responded with perfect lieutenant deference. Commendable dedication, Bennett continued, echoing Wilson's earlier phrasing. However, Lieutenant Parker has identified some concerning patterns in your activities. Unusual interest in specific electronic components, unauthorized access to secured inventory records, communication with personnel outside standard reporting structures. The accusations were carefully constructed, technically accurate, while misrepresenting legitimate activities as suspicious behavior. Standard technique for discrediting potential whistleblowers. All activities conducted under Major Rivera's direct authorization, sir. Morgan responded, maintaining her cover persona while documenting Bennett's approach for future evidence. Major Rivera has shown perhaps excessive zeal in certain administrative areas, Bennett countered smoothly. Her concerns have been reviewed previously and found unsubstantiated. His expression conveyed professional regret, masking satisfaction. Unfortunately, your involvement in these unfounded investigations has created operational complications requiring immediate resolution. Morgan recognized the approaching administrative trap, official reassignment, or disciplinary action to remove her from position before evidence could be presented to higher authority. Standard corrupt command technique when facing potential exposure. I've taken the liberty of processing priority transfer orders. Bennett continued, sliding document across his desk. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to Naval Station Kitsap. Transport departs at 2100 tonight. Your replacement has already been notified. The tactical approach was elegant in its simplicity. Remove the lieutenant through legitimate personnel action before she could present evidence or reach higher command. Under normal circumstances, a lieutenant would have no recourse against captain's direct transfer order. I understand, sir, Morgan replied, examining the transfer documentation with appropriate resignation. The orders appeared completely legitimate, bearing necessary authorizations and following proper protocol. Bennett had clearly refined this technique through previous experience removing potential whistleblowers. Your dedication is noted, Lieutenant, Bennett added with false sincerity. This transfer represents opportunity rather than censure. Kitsap offers excellent career development potential for ambitious officers. Morgan recognized the implicit threat beneath professional courtesy. Accept reassignment quietly or face career-ending negative evaluation. Standard intimidation tactic for silencing internal concerns. Permission to collect personal effects before transport, Sir Morgan requested with appropriate deference. Of course, Bennett replied, satisfaction evident beneath professional veneer. Lieutenant Parker will assist with your departure preparations for security purposes. The escort confirmed their continuing suspicion Parker would ensure she departed without further documentation or communication. Their tactical approach was professionally sound when dealing with a lieutenant. Unfortunately for them, they weren't actually dealing with a lieutenant. Morgan departed Bennett's office with Parker following at professionally appropriate distance. The charade would continue for approximately 2 more hours until Harrison's accelerated command transition authorization activated at 2000. Until then, she would maintain lieutenant persona while finalizing preparation for command assumption. Unfortunate development, Parker commented as they walked toward junior officers' quarters. Rapid transfers can disrupt professional momentum. Unavoidable in service requirements. Morgan responded with appropriate resignation, noting Parker's careful observation of her reaction. His intelligence training was evident in his approach at assessing behavioral cues indicating potential resistance or acceptance. Admiral Wilson specifically recommended Kitsap. Parker continued watching for response. He felt your skills might be better applied there. The implied threat was unmistakable. Wilson's personal involvement in her removal indicated the seriousness with which they viewed her potential threat. A lieutenant facing Admiral's direct involvement would have no practical recourse. Admiral Wilson is known for personnel development interest, Morgan replied neutrally, providing expected response while revealing nothing of her actual tactical assessment. As they reached junior officers' quarters, Parker maintained professional distance while clearly intending to monitor her packing process. I'll wait outside while you gather personal items. Transport departs in 90 minutes. Morgan acknowledged with appropriate military courtesy, entering her quarters with calm efficiency. Once inside, she began standard packing procedure while actually implementing final preparation for command transition. Her genuine Admiral's uniform remained concealed in specially designed compartment within her duffel bag. The secure communications device contained Harrison's final authorization for accelerated command assumption. Outside her door, Parker maintained surveillance position, undoubtedly ensuring she didn't attempt unauthorized communication or documentation removal. His tactical position was sound based on his understanding of the situation. That understanding would change dramatically within the hour. At precisely 1945, Morgan's secure device vibrated with incoming communication. Harrison's message was characteristically concise. Authorization confirmed. NCIS team in position. Command transfer documentation delivered to Base Command Center. Weather station activation available if required. Morgan acknowledged receipt, then completed packing preparations. The tactical sequence was established. At 2000, she would proceed to the command briefing, where Bennett was scheduled to update Wilson on operational readiness. All key conspiracy members would be present simultaneously, ideal conditions for maximum operational impact. At 1955, Morgan emerged from her quarters duffel bag packed with lieutenant possessions visible and Admiral insignia concealed. Parker waited outside, his posture suggesting satisfaction with operational resolution. Transport awaiting at main gate, he informed her, clearly pleased with the efficiency of her removal. I'll escort you directly. I'd like to say goodbye to Major Rivera first. Morgan requested, providing expected resistance to test reaction. Parker's refusal was diplomatically firm. Unfortunately, the transport schedule doesn't permit additional stops. I'm sure you understand. Morgan nodded with appropriate resignation, allowing Parker to believe his control of the situation remained intact. As they walked toward the main gate, Morgan noted the time, 1957. 3 minutes until Harrison's authorization activated. 3 minutes until she transformed from departing lieutenant to commanding admiral. As they approached the administration building, Morgan implemented the final stage of her tactical plan. I believe I left my service record in Major Rivera's office earlier today, she stated with convincing concern. Required for KitSat processing. Parker's annoyance was visible beneath professional exterior. The administration building is in the opposite direction from the main gate, Lieutenant. The records are required for transfer processing, Morgan insisted with appropriate deference. Delay now would create greater complications upon arrival. Parker checked his watch, 1958, then made tactical decision balancing schedule against procedural requirements. 5 minutes maximum, direct retrieval only. Morgan acknowledged with appropriate gratitude, adjusting course toward administration building. Her timing was precise, creating legitimate reason to approach command center at exactly the moment Harrison's authorization would be delivered and processed. As they entered the administration building, Morgan noted increased activity surrounding the command center, expected result of Harrison's authorization being received and verified. Confusion would be spreading through command structure as they attempted to reconcile Lieutenant Hayes' impending transfer with documentation identifying her as the incoming base commander. Parker registered the unusual activity with professional concern, his intelligence training recognizing potential operational complication. Before he could intervene, Colonel Gibson emerged from the command center, his expression showing confused recognition as he spotted Morgan. Lieutenant Hayes, Gibson called, approaching with bewilderment evident. There seems to be significant confusion regarding your status. Parker moved immediately to intercept, maintaining operational control. Lieutenant Hayes is currently under transfer orders to Naval Station Kitsap, Colonel. Departure scheduled for 2100. Gibson's confusion deepened as he looked between Parker and Morgan. That's not possible. I've just received official Pentagon documentation confirming Hayes as incoming base commander. Admiral Hayes. The moment of revelation had arrived precisely as planned. Parker's expression transformed from confident control to shocked reassessment as understanding dawned. His intelligence training provided faster comprehension than most would experience, recognizing the tactical situation had completely inverted in seconds. There seems to be administrative confusion, Colonel, Morgan stated calmly, reaching into her duffel's concealed compartment. She removed her admiral's insignia and identification, presenting them with practiced authority. Admiral Morgan Hayes, officially assuming command of Jefferson Bay Naval Base under Pentagon authorization CNO 7745 Alpha. Gibson examined the credentials with growing comprehension, his military training asserting itself through confusion. These appear completely authentic, but how? Full explanation forthcoming, Colonel. Morgan replied with the natural command presence she had suppressed beneath lieutenant persona. First priority is securing base command functions. Please direct me to the scheduled briefing with Admiral Wilson. Parker remained frozen in tactical reassessment, his intelligence training, processing the operational implications of lieutenant transforming to admiral before his eyes. His expression shifted from shock to calculation as he evaluated potential responses. Lieutenant Parker, Morgan addressed him directly, her tone carrying unmistakable command authority. Your presence is required at this briefing as well. Parker's training reasserted itself, professional demeanor returning as he calculated new approach. Of course, Admiral, he acknowledged formal military protocol, masking tactical recalibration. Gibson led them toward the briefing room, still processing the unprecedented situation. As they walked, Morgan contacted Walker using base communication systems now legitimately under her authority. Implementation phase active. All security teams deploy as instructed. Walker's acknowledgement was immediate and formal, initiating the coordinated security response they had prepared. Throughout the base, trusted personnel Morgan had identified through her covert observation were activating, securing critical locations in evidence simultaneously. The command briefing room door opened to reveal Wilson and Bennett reviewing operational documentation. Both men looked up with mild annoyance at the interruption, their expressions transforming to shock as they registered Morgan's admiral insignia. What is the meaning of this? Wilson demanded, recovering first. Morgan entered with full command presence, years of leadership training evident in every movement. Admiral Morgan Hayes, assuming command of Jefferson Bay Naval Base under direct Pentagon authorization. Colonel Gibson, please secure the room. Gibson hesitated momentarily, decades of military hierarchy conflicting with unexpected authority reassignment. Morgan anticipated his uncertainty, presenting Harrison's written authorization bearing the Secretary of the Navy's signature. Authentication code Bravo Echo 79 Delta. Morgan added, providing the verification protocol that would confirm her authority through official channels. Gibson examined the documentation, then made his decision. Military discipline asserting itself through confusion. Security details secure the room. No entry or exit until further notice. Wilson's face darkened with barely controlled anger. This is completely irregular. I wasn't informed of command transfer acceleration. Intentionally, Admiral Wilson, Morgan replied calmly, placing her secure communication device on the conference table. The device activated projecting holographic display of evidence, documentation, supply chain discrepancies, component diversions, security protocol violations, financial transactions, connecting Wilson to offshore accounts. For the past 5 days, I've been conducting covert assessment of Jefferson Bay operations revealing systematic corruption involving critical naval components. This evidence confirms coordinated criminal conspiracy reaching to Pacific Command level. Bennett's expression collapsed from authority to panic tactical assessment, revealing the comprehensive nature of Morgan's investigation. Parker maintained professional composure intelligence training, preparing him better for operational failure. Wilson, however, relied on rank and authority even as evidence mounted before him. This theatrical performance changes nothing, Hayes. You've overstepped severely. One phone call to Washington will end your career before it properly begins. Morgan met his gaze directly, command presence, unwavering. All communications with Washington are currently routed through secure Pentagon channels, Admiral. NCIS teams have already deployed throughout the base, securing evidence and implementing counterintelligence protocols. On cue, the briefing room door opened to admit Senior Agent Thompson of Naval Criminal Investigative Service, accompanied by armed security detail. Command authentication confirmed through Pentagon channels, Thompson announced professionally. Admiral Hayes has operational authority effective immediately. Wilson's final attempt at authority collapsed as Thompson continued. Admiral Wilson, Captain Bennett, Lieutenant Parker, you are hereby detained under Article 134 pending investigation into conspiracy fraud and actions detrimental to national security. You have the right to remain silent. As NCIS personnel implemented formal detention procedures, Morgan observed the culmination of her unconventional command transition approach. The corruption network that had systematically undermined Jefferson Bay's operational capabilities for years was being dismantled in real time, its key members facing consequences of their actions. Colonel Gibson approached with professional military bearing, his initial confusion replaced by disciplined acceptance of command transition. Orders, Admiral. Morgan turned to her new executive officer. Command responsibility, settling naturally onto shoulders prepared through years of leadership training. Implement base security protocol, Sierra 5. All pending shipments, suspended pending verification. Communications systems secured under NCIS supervision. Prepare all hands briefing for 0800 tomorrow. As Gibson departed to implement instructions, Morgan contacted Walker using her now official command authority. Security team status. All primary objectives secured. Admiral Walker reported with professional satisfaction. Major Rivera coordinating documentation preservation. Chief Cole implementing communications security protocols. Original components from this morning's diversion recovered from secondary storage facility. Morgan acknowledged with approval. Her unconventional approach had yielded critical intelligence impossible through traditional command transition. The evidence gathered during 5 days of covert observation would ensure the corruption network's complete dismantling rather than merely removing visible participants. As NCIS personnel escorted Wilson, Bennett, and Parker from the briefing room, Morgan allowed herself momentary reflection on the operation's success. Her father's tactical philosophy had proven effective once again. Understanding operational reality required experiencing it directly, not merely reviewing filtered reports from subordinates. 6 months later, Jefferson Bay Naval Base had undergone complete transformation. Morgan Hayes stood on the command center balcony surveying the installation, now operating at peak efficiency under her leadership. The systematic corruption that had undermined operations for years had been completely eradicated, its participants facing military justice for their actions. Major Rivera, promoted to lieutenant colonel, now headed the base's newly established Supply Chain Integrity Division, implementing verification protocols that had become model for naval installations nationwide. Chief Cole had received commendation for his steadfast maintenance of communication systems despite deliberate sabotage attempts. Senior Chief Walker, recognized for his unwavering integrity throughout years of corruption, advised the Pentagon on new security implementation strategies. Admiral Harrison visited quarterly, his weathered face showing genuine satisfaction with Morgan's command performance. Their unconventional approach to command transition had not merely exposed specific corruption, but revolutionized Navy leadership philosophy. Understanding operational reality required experiencing it directly. Lesson now taught at Annapolis using Morgan's Jefferson Bay operation as case study. The base that had nearly lost a destroyer to navigation failure now maintained the highest readiness ratings in the Pacific Fleet. Equipment functioned at optimal capability, personnel operated with renewed purpose, and leadership demonstrated genuine integrity rather than superficial authority. As Morgan watched vessels departing for Pacific exercises equipment, verified personnel, prepared mission capability, assured she reflected on her father's legacy. William Hayes had taught her that true leadership meant taking risks when principles demanded action, regardless of personal consequences or conventional approaches. Jefferson Bay Naval Base stood as testament to that philosophy, transformed from systematic corruption to operational excellence through unconventional leadership and unwavering integrity. The admiral, who had first arrived as lieutenant, had demonstrated the most critical military leadership principle. Understanding those you command requires walking in their footsteps, not merely reviewing their reports. Morgan Hayes' daughter, Admiral Commander, had honored that principle. Jefferson Bay would never be the same.